We're now live.
Good morning and welcome to this meeting of the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Combined Authority Overview and Scrutiny Committee meeting. And we have a number of items on our agenda, including of particular interest, I think, the presentation and opportunity for questions of Baroness Brown on the Independent Commission on Climate Change, but we've got a number of other issues to discuss as well. I'm going to start now by requesting apologies. Do we have any apologies?
We have had apologies from Councillor David Connor.
Thank you very much. And Anne, would you now like please to take a roll call of all members, and members, would you say either yes or present or something to indicate that you are present at the meeting?
Councillor Jordan.
Present.
Councillor Corney.
Present.
Councillor Sharp.
Present.
Councillor Dupre.
Present.
Councillor Fane.
Present.
Councillor Chamberlain.
Present.
Councillor Hay.
Present.
Councillor Scrutiny.
Present.
Councillor Gehring. Councillor Davey.
Present.
Councillor Scutt.
Present.
Councillor Coles.
Present.
Councillor Murphy.
Present.
Thank you very much indeed. We now go on to declarations of interest, and I remind you that if you have a disclosable pecuniary interest or other interest in any of the items on the agenda, you'll need to disclose it now unless it's already entered in the register of members' interests. Does anybody have any interests that they need to declare? Not seeing any. Thank you very much indeed. So then we move on to the minutes of our previous meeting, which was on the 22nd of February. Does anybody have any issues with the accuracy of those minutes? No, we're happy to accept those then. Thank you. But as a follow on from those, Councillor Anne Hay, as chair of the Bus Task and Finish group, has asked to make a statement. So over to Councillor Hay.
Thank you, Chairman. I wish to make a statement with regard to my report I presented to the previous Overview and Scrutiny meeting, excuse me, in my capacity as chair of the CPCA ONS Bus Review and Task and Finish group, which is reported in the minutes. Stagecoach have been in contact with me following that meeting and given a statement of their view, which is that there has been no change to its long-standing view that partnership between bus operators and local authorities rather than franchising is the best way to deliver the most sustainable bus networks for communities for the long term, which obviously differs from my previous understanding of their policy in that they were coming round to the idea of franchising. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor Hay. We move on then to public questions, and I understand that there are no public questions.
No public.
So we move on then to item 5, which is the Independent Commission on Climate Change. And I hope at this stage we will be bringing into the meeting Baroness Brown, who is chair of the Independent Commission on Climate Change, and also Adrian Cannard and Paul Raynes should be with us. And they will be here to present the interim report, which was published 7 days ago on Monday, the 15th. So I see we have Baroness Brown already with us, Adrian Cannard joining the meeting, I think. And are we going to be seeing Paul Raynes? I don't see him as yet.
He's not there at the moment. I'm just trying to get him for you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. So welcome very much indeed, Baroness Brown and Adrian. Baroness Brown, I attended the launch last Monday of the interim report, which I thought was an excellent event. So thank you very much indeed for putting that on, and to your team for fielding the many questions about your report. I see we have Councillor Gehring joining us as well. Baroness Brown, perhaps are you in a position to introduce your interim report and tell us a few particular issues of interest that you think might be relevant to us, and then happy to take questions, yes, from us.
Absolutely, and thank you for joining the
Thank you.
launch. I shall give a very quick overview of the launch presentation, and then very happy to take any questions. So just to say, I think we were quite surprised to discover that emissions in the region on a per capita basis are 25% above the UK average and are falling more slowly than the UK average. I think we already knew that, of course, that we are an area at high risk from climate change. We're down in the southeast where temperatures have been rising at between 0.8 and 1 degree per decade since the 1960s. So we could be seeing 40 degrees C maximum temperatures, that is, by the 2050s. We could also, by the 2050s, be seeing much more in the way of summer drought, with rainfall falling as much as 25%, and more flooding in the winter, with rainfall increasing as much as 16%. So we've got high emissions, we are at high risk, and it is urgent that we act, because if we continue with emissions as they are, if we want to, well, we will have run out, if you like, of our allowance of emissions. If we are to be part of meeting net zero nationally, we will run out of that allowance in only 6 years' time, which is also, I think, quite a shocking piece of information. So in our report, we've concentrated very much on 3 areas in this first part of the report. We've concentrated on transport. The reasons for that is that our transport emissions are 50% higher per head than the UK average, and we've seen 3 times the rate of increase in the last 10 years or so than the UK average. So car and van mileage is over 1/3 higher, and HGV mileage, not surprisingly because we're on so many important routes, is more than double the national average. We've concentrated on buildings and homes in particular because of being an area that where we're projected to see a huge increase in building of new homes and growth of population. So by 2050, some 40% of the housing stock will be that new build. Otherwise, on the homes front, we're slightly better than average, with more properties about EPC C, a good insulation standard or above. And of course, because we've looked at homes and transport, it's very difficult not to look at the energy system and also water. So we've included a limited view about energy and water, and we'll come back to water in much more detail in the next part of our report. And then thirdly, as our really core focus, we've looked at peat, because peat could be as much as 45% of our total emissions, but actually there's a huge uncertainty about this. So not only is peat potentially a huge part of the emissions, but also, of course, it's of key economic importance to the farming parts of the region and to the UK's food supply. Of course, there are lots of benefits of taking action on climate change, not just reducing the impacts for everybody, but the opportunity to have a region with better homes, with better air quality, with more green space, with lots of good jobs, and generally with better health and well-being for the population. So a whole lot of list of things that really everybody, I'm sure, would want. But we do have a very significant task ahead of us. We need an enormous expansion, for example, in the electric vehicle charging network. We've got more than half of our buildings below that good insulation standard EPCC, even though we're better than the UK average, it's still more than half are below. It looks like we will need something like 700 million per annum of investment to address these issues over the next 10 years. And of course, we've got to address the land use and peat challenges. So we've come up with a wide range of recommendations. I'll just highlight some of the top ones. In transport, we think we need by 2022 a plan for electric vehicle infrastructure rollout. By 2030, we would like to see zero emission taxis, buses and council vehicles, or all zero emission. We think we should be planning for a 15% reduction in car miles driven by 2030. The Committee on Climate Change recommends a range between 7 to 16%, and we think because of our high car miles driven per head at the moment, we need to be targeting the top end of that range. And by 2030, we think diesel vans and trucks should be excluded from city centres. So we should be looking at consolidation centres and onward travel into our city and town centres by zero emission vehicles. So hopefully bicycles and zero emission vans. In terms of buildings, it's really crucial we focus on ensuring that our new builds are climate ready, and we want to see them climate ready by 2023. And by that, we don't just mean ready to be zero emissions. So with zero emission, ready for zero emissions heating. We mean also in terms of water consumption, because we really do need to address the issue of water efficiency if we're going to avert really significant water shortages in the region. We need a plan for heat decarbonisation on a local and regional basis. We need zero carbon renovation plans for all buildings below EPCC, and we'd like to see those in place by 2025. Clearly, this is going to need financing support for homeowners and others, and so we have recommendations about how that might be approached. And also, we need to see standards enforced, both in new build, but also in refurbishment and refit. For energy and water, well, for energy, we need a local area energy plan. And for energy and water, we have recommendations for the regulators, which is that it's absolutely key that they get a move on with allowing the energy and the water companies to invest ahead of need in order to anticipate the additional requirements on electricity that are going to be needed, and also the additional requirements for water that's going to be needed to support the region. And on peat, we recommend the setting up of a Fenland Peat Committee to look at developing and sharing best practice amongst our farmers, to look at mapping, starting to map and understand the condition and the type of peat, because that hasn't been looked at now for many years, and also looking at how we can raise funding locally to fill some of the research gaps that we still have about peat and the future of peat. In terms of recommendations to the CPCA itself, we recommend that there needs to be a climate cabinet chaired by the mayor, and that needs to involve clearly all of the councils, but all of the other key stakeholders. So the water and energy providers, the major organisations such as the NHS locally, the major landowners, a broad range of the key stakeholders to have a common strategy. That needs to be supported by a funded delivery team, and a delivery team that's there to work with local stakeholders and local councils to help them achieve these things, not to take away from people responsibilities that they have, but to be facilitating and supporting. But that we need a high-level climate action plan, which needs targets, actions and monitoring, and it needs to be engaging with the public about information, education and behaviour change, something which the public in the region said very strongly was something they wanted more of, so they could understand what they can do. We also think at CPCA level, we need a green investment team, because this huge investment that's particularly in improving the condition of our buildings is going to need upfront funding. There will be savings downstream, but there is a lot of capital funding required upfront. And so we think that the CPCA will be need to use its borrowing powers, but it may, well, we think it will also need to be looking at financial instruments such as local green bonds, and therefore will need a professional team to support that and to use that course to support all of the councils in the region. We think every policy, plan, development, procurement needs a climate assessment. So, for example, it needs to consider the need for roads versus public transport, cycling, or broadband investment, because there is plenty of evidence that more road building actually creates more traffic. So we need to make sure all those sorts of decisions are tensioned in the context of us needing to reduce our emissions. We would like to see the CPCA and all of the councils commit to their operations being net zero by 2030. We think there is a huge need and opportunity for a skills plan. The Environmental Audit Committee in the House of Commons has just reported on its review of the government's plans to reduce emissions from buildings, and it's pointed out the enormous lack of skills in terms of building management, building refurbishment, zero carbon heat in buildings. And that seems, that's both a challenge, but also a real opportunity for the region to be making sure that we are providing really high quality training in that area and indeed other areas of the energy and green transition. We think there are innovation opportunities, particularly with strengths in the region in agri-tech and green tech, but we think it's at the moment seems a little disappointing that those don't seem to be coming forward in the way that some of our other technology successes are. And so we think we need to look more deeply into that and understand how we bring forward those regional opportunities. And finally, we would like to see the region as a national, if not an international centre for demonstrating some of the new technologies we need for a net zero world, building, of course, on our outstanding academic base in the region. So that's a very quick summary, very high level summary of our report, but very happy to answer your questions as far as I can.
Thank you very much indeed, Baroness Brown. That's been very quick given the volume of material that's been produced and very comprehensive. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to use Chair's privilege to start by asking a couple of questions, and then I'll throw it open more generally. I know that you have Adrian with you here today, and I think Paul Raynes, though I can't see him, maybe on the call as well. Yes, we can now. Hurrah. Welcome, Paul. So if I could just put three questions, and I see there's already hands going up, so there's a lot of interest in this, as one would expect. But my three questions to you are, firstly, of all of the areas that you have covered in your report to date, which of course is only part of the picture, as you yourself have said, there's more to come. Which do you think are the most intractable issues, or which is the most intractable issue, and why? Secondly, which is the area do you think that is going to encounter the most resistance in terms of implementing your proposals? And thirdly, there are two particular initiatives that I'm aware of that I wanted to hear from you how you viewed those fitting into what you're proposing. The first one is the Fens Biosphere proposal. And the second one is the proposal that arose out of the Cambridgeshire County Council's Cuspy policy challenges on a Cambridgeshire decarbonisation fund, and whether that helps to address any of the issues that you were talking about in terms of being able to build up a fund to implement some of these issues and initiatives. So those were my three, and then I'll throw it open.
So I think of all the areas covered, which is the most intractable? Well, I think the biggest challenge, as it is across the country, is this one of low carbon heat. We've got something like 350,000 buildings which need to be converted to low carbon heat. Some of that will be heat pumps, some of that may be zero carbon district heating schemes. Some of that maybe at some point in the future involve hydrogen, or although we don't think this is a region where hydrogen will be arriving early, So we think that's something we shouldn't be focusing on. So that's a lot of assessing buildings, a lot of really good understanding of how best to insulate a wide range of different types of buildings, and a lot of historic buildings, of course, and a lot of skills needed for heat pumps and district heating schemes, and also making sure people get really high quality advice about what is the right way for a particular building to approach the conversion. So I see that, and it's also, of course, the area where there is the biggest upfront cost in many ways, and the slowest payback. So that's what's going to need a very significant chunk of the estimated 700 million or so per annum for the next 10 years. So I think that needs an enormous amount of focus, and it needs a huge amount of communication with people, with the population, with our residents, about what they need, what they can and what they need to do, and what the benefits to them will be. So in some ways, that comes on to question 2, which is, I think that is one of the areas where we will see the most resistance. Clearly, there are some sensible places to start, like council and housing association homes, where it'll be easier to do some of this. But owner occupiers are going to be particularly challenging, and particularly owner occupiers like me, who've already paid off their mortgages, where of course, green loans and green mortgages and things are no longer of particular interest. So I think amongst the older generation, that's going to be a particular challenge. Of course, in terms of resistance, our farmers are already experiencing, I think, a huge amount of insecurity in terms of the change from the Common Agricultural Policy funding to how the new ELM scheme is going to work for them. Some of them seeing challenges also with being able to export under the new the changes that leaving the EU has brought. So I think for them this sounds quite threatening. The fact that we should be the Committee on Climate Change is saying we should be re-wetting a very large amount of our peat, and we should also be moving some of our farmland over to growing trees and things. I think they've got an awful lot of change being thrown at them. And so I think it's a really critical role for the Fenland Peat Committee, not only to understand the condition of our peat, but to really engage with the farming community to help them understand how they can still have successful, productive and futures where they can still earn a living from the land. So I think that's going to be another area where resistance is going to be quite challenging. I don't personally know enough about the Fens Biosphere project, but I think my impression from the members of the team who are, from the commissioners who are engaged in that, is that it seems to align with some of the things that we think are very important. So I think a generally positive. In terms of the Cambridgeshire Decarbonisation Fund, if this is, and again, I'm not quite sure if this is, I know exactly which one this is. If this is the fund which essentially encourages people to pay money into a fund as a type of offsetting, then I sympathise entirely with the reason for it. I just have some concerns that offsetting and action are two different things. And if people think that they have paid to continue to do what they're doing, and therefore they don't need to make any changes, that's a slightly dangerous, well, could be a very dangerous impression to give them. However, if they're taking action, but also essentially while that action is coming to fruition, prepared to pay for offsetting the emissions before they've managed to reduce them, then it could be, if managed appropriately, it could be a useful way of helping raise funding for decarbonisation projects. So I think it's quite a challenging one. I would like to see, I think we would all like to see the combined authority taking on this role of finding ways of using financial instruments like green bonds to raise some very significant amounts of money to help with the upfront funding of some of the changes we're going to see, particularly in the buildings area, so that we can be providing really low cost green loans to local householders to make these changes.
Thanks very much indeed, Baroness Brown. That's extremely helpful. I've got a number of hands up and I'm going to take them in the order in which they appear in my list of participants, which I think is the order in which they've been put up. So I'll start with Councillor Davey.
Thank you, Baroness Brown. I really welcome the report and the ambition of the report. It is something deeply impressive, although invariably loads of questions must follow. And bearing in mind the numbers who wanted to speak, I'll cut to the chase. I'm the finance portfolio holder for Cambridge City Council. We have 7,500 council homes. So as you could probably imagine, the cost of how we go about retrofitting becomes a really significant issue for us. And I'd welcome any thoughts you might have further on that, because it won't just be about, obviously, us as a council house provider, but other authorities who will have huge interest and stakes in social housing. The second question is about, which you may want to leave to elsewhere, is about the buses and the ambition, again, ambitious and welcome, but the ambition to have carbon neutral bus fleet by 2050 across the county, because that then has other knock-ons about how the buses are charged and how it's done, bearing in mind the scale and the scope and the geography of the county. So I'd welcome any further thoughts you might have, but it's most important to stress, really welcome the report and what you're trying to get us to do. So thank you.
Well, the first part of the financing of, and it's great that you're thinking about council homes and social housing, because in terms of retrofit, that's obviously a very good place to start, and also has, from a social equity point of view, giving those people a better quality of house or flat, with refurbished and with low heating costs, is actually a very positive thing for us to be doing across the region. That's why we want the CPCA to have a very strong new finance team with to look at financial instruments like green bonds to raise significant sums of money to in order to leverage and increase whatever initiatives we're going to be seeing from central government. At the moment, the central government initiatives have not got off to a great start, so I think we need local action to amplify that. And Russell Pico, who is a banker who is on one of our commissioners, is very keen to bring in some colleagues who would be interested in completely, not trying to sell services of particular organisations at all, but to have some sort of workshops with CPCA and councils to explore what are the kind of mechanisms that could be used for raising some of this money locally in order to do this. In terms of the buses ambition, well, there have been various organisations have made statements about all new buses should be electric or hydrogen by 2030. We feel this is that we need to move quickly because of our very high transport emissions locally. So we felt that was an appropriate ambition. That's one of the reasons why we think the climate cabinet is needed, was because in talking to the network, in talking to UK Power Networks, we were quite concerned that they were working on their vision of what was needed in the electricity network for the future, and it didn't entirely tie up with what we'd heard from people in different councils and things and their visions. And we felt there needs to be a really common vision with UK Power Networks able to invest ahead of need in order to provide those links, for example, to park and ride areas for charging and other places where charging will be needed. And that advice clearly needs to come from the CPCA and the councils to power networks. We just felt that that link needs to be so much stronger. There needs to be absolutely a shared plan between the key players in the region.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Councillor Murphy.
Thank you. Just a couple of questions. A little bit of an ad first. You moved on to behavioural change, which I think is really, really important. And I'm wondering what we're going to get from the board and our other partners. And I think we need to focus on the role that we as Scrutiny can play in getting some of these things done. And I think the report is actually balanced. It's saying, look, these are the things we can actually do. Let's get on with it. And I think we do need a big behavioural change. I've just embarked upon carbon literacy training. I've got rid of the car. I'm struggling to get rid of the boiler. I can't wait for hydrogen, but we're working on ways about it. But I do think, really, from your report, there's some key things that we should have done already, and hopefully we can move now. The climate assessment of all our projects and our programmes, we should have been doing it. The combined authority is involved in transport, infrastructure, housing. They're the key areas to tackle the climate emergency. So we should have been doing this assessment. Maybe we've been doing it, but not shouting about it. But we haven't been doing it because we've been funding things. Now, I come from Peterborough, and this authority has funded encroachments on our green spaces, building a university out of concrete with car parks on our embankment. You know, we really do need now the board and us to help them in scrutinising to wake up and commit to behavioural change and to actually do it. We can pick off some of those things we can really, really do now. So yes, let's support a climate assessment of all our programmes and our funding. Let's move on to the green bonds. Let's encourage people, behavioural change. Let's get that money to refit buildings, etc., etc. But let's have a word with our partners and say, stop this. Stop pulling down swimming pools. Stop building down council buildings and building new ones out of concrete when you can refit, when you can make them carbon zero with some effort. So I do hope that the board accept this report and pull out as much of it as they can to move on to actually now start contributing dramatically to zero carbon and do it as quickly as we can. But I do thank you for all the work that's been done. And Scrutiny, can we please challenge these people, and can we call for a moratorium now on funding where the climate assessment has not been done?
Thank you very much, Ed. I think before I bring in Baroness Brown, I think some of that was a challenge to the existing operation of the combined authority, and I wondered whether Paul had any immediate response to any of those challenges.
As you know, Chair, the Combined Authority Board will be discussing this on Wednesday. The recommendation in front of them is not just to welcome the report, and obviously they will do that because this is a very high quality piece of work. I mean, I've had the opportunity to see the commissioners at work, and there's some fantastic evidence and analysis in here. So, but above and beyond that, what the board will be invited to do on Wednesday is to task officers with working up an implementation plan. So it's probably a little premature for me to say exactly how we will be steered in that discussion on Wednesday. As you've identified, you know, all the members of this committee look as if they're going to have opinions to feed into that discussion. I'm sure there'll be a lot of opinions expressed by members of the board on Wednesday. And at this point, until we have had our instruction from the elected members of the board, I'm not sure there's much more I can say at this point. They're obviously happy to answer on kind of technical questions that don't bear on the steer we get from the board on Wednesday.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. Baroness Brown, you were going to respond to Councillor Murphy, I think.
Well, just to say we are very keen that in a way that all investments are considered in the context of the vision of the future we need to be delivering. And so that the climate change assessment is I think a really critical thing that needs to be taken very seriously. So it would be, I'm sure, very positive if that was getting some scrutiny.
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Scutt.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Baroness Brown, for a comprehensive report so far. I actually have a very short question I'd like to ask, and it goes to the issue of water, because here in Cambridge and Cambridgeshire, the greatest concern has been the lack of water and problems in that regard, and problems with the chalk streams and so on. However, I was just reading a report recently from the University of Sydney, which raises the problem of water from another perspective, and that is the problem of too much water. So I'm wondering if your commission will be looking also at this perspective. What the University of Sydney research seems to be showing is that where there is development and where roads are going down, footpaths are going down, houses are being put on land, it means that the water that would otherwise seep through the land and be absorbed within the land is actually needing to find an alternative way of getting rid of itself. So what's happening is it's going into dams, and the dams are now overflowing. It's a problem with Warringamba Dam, which is in New South Wales, in Sydney, or just outside Sydney. So I'm wondering whether this perspective has been looked at here or might be looked at here, because although I accept the lack of water is a problem, we are subject to flooding in Cambridgeshire, and that may be exacerbated if a lot of development is going on, which is actually depriving the water of the opportunity to be absorbed into land which is now covered with concrete and bitumen and housing and buildings. Thank you.
Well, you raise a very important point, Councillor Scutt, and although the climate change is likely to make it mean that we will more likely have drought in the summer months, we will probably see more rain in the winter months. And when it does rain, there's an increased likelihood that will be short periods of very intense rainfall. And that does lead to surface water flooding, and all of the issues that you raised exacerbate surface water flooding, particularly the lack of porous, or the reduction in porous surfaces. Now, you can get around that, and I think the university development at Eddington on the outskirts of Cambridge is a very good example of using sustainable urban drainage systems, which combines green roofs and water channels and porous paving and other porous surfaces in order to make sure that the water still has somewhere to soak away. And we do need to be careful in many areas that kind of development is what we do for the future. It also emphasizes again the need for us to incorporate green space into developments, which gives so very many benefits. But you're absolutely right, that is one of the adaptation issues that we need to be looking at in the region, and we will focus even more strongly on adaptation in the next part of our report. And the University of Cambridge are doing a very interesting study alongside our report, which they are continuing to develop to look at how the risk of problems like that is going to be developing across the region. So I hope you'll find that helpful.
Good. Thank you, Baroness. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Corney.
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Baroness Brown. I can honestly say it's not very often that I get a 120-page document come through that I'm happy to see and look forward to sort of getting into. So I genuinely mean that as well. I've got a couple of observations and then to sort of follow up on a bit of a question, really. I think observation-wise, it's really welcome to see what's coming through. I mean, especially that, a little bit on what Councillor Scutt's just mentioned about, sort of flood alleviation, being built into new properties. And I know that from being a district councillor and working with county council, things are already coming through on there. So some joined up thinking there, which is really welcome. So the rainwater harvesting, sort of these sort of systems coming through, they're great. Probably, as an observation, I'd probably go a little bit in a different direction for Councillor Murphy. I think but I agree with its behaviour that needs looking at quite dramatically all round really. But we live in a world where we have no issues with a car coming to the end of its life, with exception of a few what we'd call classics. But we would quite happily scrap a car, but we'll continually look at an old house that's not efficient, and we'll keep trying to chop it and change it. And when in reality, I think if we was all realistic about it, it'd be far more efficient if we were to knock it down and build something that's sustainable. And yes, concrete might not be very good, but then equally, if it's done correctly, I think it could be something that it's more important that it's something that's going to last and be efficient at the same time. I think so. To round it up, though, the question I've got really was we look at air source, which is fantastic, and as a heat form, but as a builder and working with housing associations as well, the complexity and how difficult it is to install solar, which air source is brilliant, but with solar it's even better. And if something could be done there to sort of clear that water as opposed to mudding it as we do at the moment, where the tariffs can't be transferred and it makes it very difficult.
I would certainly agree on that. We've recently had an air source heat pump installed, and it's working very well. But with the current way that the government chooses to put all of the costs of low carbon, of the energy transition essentially onto electricity, but not onto gas, it means, unfortunately, for people, actually at the moment, that's a rather expensive option. And one of the things the Climate Change Committee has said to the government, it really needs to review the taxation on fuels and needs to start to move the costs of carbon and the cost of the energy transition from electricity to gas, so that that electricity becomes cheaper for consumers and people, people in social housing or council homes where a heat pump has been installed. We need to make sure that's a cost-effective way for them to run their heating. But we also have neighbours across the road who have solar on their roof, and they keep coming and telling us how much of their electricity that's providing, and making us quite jealous. So, but you're right, integrating those systems better has to be the way forward.
Thank you. Councillor Gehring.
Yes, thank you very much, Baroness Brown. I echo what colleagues have said. This is the first time that I've seen a combined authority document that I'm absolutely 100% in favor of, which is rare given that I've been on this overview and scrutiny committee for 3 years. But I wanted to, given that we don't have time, so I wholeheartedly welcome your report. I endorse the sort of bold proposals that you've made. But let me push you a little bit further, because my constituents, 3/4 of the emails I receive are on climate change, and that might be because my residents are particularly worried about this. Shouldn't we be bolder than, aren't you already in your independent climate report balancing too much, so that it will be easy for the board to balance some more and not to make any progress in the long term? And the concrete questions I had was from, for example, it's now good practice in most local authorities to analyze the budget also in climate terms, or at least assess the impact that certain expenditures have. You make no recommendation for the authority itself, which I think is hugely problematic. And that might have to do with your mandate. I haven't seen the sort of mandate letter or your appointment letter. That was not disclosed to the Overview and Scrutiny Committee. Second, there's a huge emphasis by the combined authority on new roads. Now, you say we should take measures to reduce car journeys by 15%, but doesn't that mean for every new road, we basically need to close or restrict traffic on existing roads how does that, in your view, work with the climate objectives? I would have liked to see something more in bus licensing. I think other colleagues have mentioned that. I think it's unfair that we as local authorities in Cambridge require all taxis to be wholly electric by 2028, but the combined authority doesn't require buses that it subsidizes to be wholly electric by any point in time. So how fast can we do that transition without external funding? And finally, there's a lot of discussion for the COP on nature-based solutions. And you mentioned peatlands, I think rightly so. I'm slightly worried that we lose the sight of forests and the huge importance that forests play in our approach to climate change. Will that come in the next report? Or where are you going to cover forest and agriculture more broadly?
Okay, there are a lot of questions there. First of all, we've tried to be pragmatic. There is an enormous amount to do. You know, by 2050, there are these 350,000 buildings to be converted to low carbon heat. That's a huge amount to do. That's a huge cost. There are all of these. There's this infrastructure for changing all our vehicles to electric or other zero emission propulsion. So we point out there is an enormous amount to do, even to do it at the speed that we are recommending. I'm just trying to find out that we recommend that the buses on routes subsidized or franchised by the CPCA should be zero emission by 2025, and that all of them should be by 2030, that all 30% of taxis should be zero emission by 2025 and 100% by 2030 achieved through license conditions, and council fleets and CPCA fleet, all fleets across the region, all council and fleets should be zero emission by 2030. We do comment on a concern about the focus on road building, and that's part of our requirement that the recommendation that all plans, major procurements, policies from CPCA and all of the councils should have a climate change assessment in order to look at whether that is in the context of trying to achieve 15% reduction in miles driven, whether roads are still the right solution, or whether there should be more investment in public transport, more investment in provision for cycling, indeed more investment in broadband perhaps in some areas would replace investment in roads. So we absolutely think there should be more analysis of that sort. So I think we do make those points in the report, perhaps when you've had a chance to pick up all of those bits. There's an awful lot in it.
Great. Nature-based solutions.
Oh, sorry, nature-based solutions. Yes, we're coming back to nature in our next report, but we do say that one of the reasons why we think there is going to be a need for fundraising, for example, green bonds or other financial instruments, is to support nature. And nature-based solutions for climate change mitigation, but also very strongly nature-based solutions for climate change adaptation. So for example, and we talk about the importance of nature and green space in all new developments, from a urban heat island, from a shading, from a surface water flooding, and generally from a well-being aspect as well. So yes, we strongly support that.
Thanks very much indeed. I've got 3 more questions, and then I'm going to need to draw a line under this because we have other business to discuss, and I know we could talk a lot about this. It's fascinating, but Councillor Coles, you're next.
Thank you, Chair, and Baroness Brown, thank you very much for all the time you put into working on the issues of climate. I think I'll cut to the chase. My issue, I suppose, is that we are asking for individuals to make changes. We're looking for the local area to change, but we're also in an environment where for climate change to be properly managed, we need both a national and international component. And I just wonder how much of what we might be able to do locally is going to have bearing when we know that there are much larger issues in more worldwide, and whether you see that the response locally is going to have an impact in when we put all of the proposals into action. And secondly, it's about really communication and education and knowledge at the local level. You know, we are essentially saying we want to prevent development on green space, and I completely understand that. But then we could also say when we are making new developments, we're actually improving the situation. And I go to Councillor Murphy's point about his concerns about knocking down the regional pool and building a new one. And he's quite right to say that's what we'd like to do, but it's also quite right to say the regional pool is the most expensive council building in the city when it comes to its environmental impact. So it's about education and about where we sit in the national international context. Thank you.
Well, I would say in terms of where we sit in the national international context, that if every country, every town and every region and every village is saying, well, if there's no point in us doing anything because we don't make enough difference, then the whole world will not do anything. So it's absolutely crucial that everyone takes action. We now have the US has come back into the Paris Agreement. We now have China committing to net zero by 2060. So we have the majority of global emissions are now covered by commitments from countries. You only have to look at the what the climate will look like even in the UK by 2080 if we're not on a path to somewhere near 2 degrees, to know that the world we are leaving for children and grandchildren is one that it will be very challenging to live in. This really isn't an option, I think, if we want to leave a decent future for humanity on this planet. This is something we all have to do, and it has to start in every household and every town and every region. You know, there isn't an exception for any of us. So I think, you know, we have to sign up for this, just as our government has signed up for it nationally, and just as most major nations have now signed up for it at Paris. So we cannot. I mean, the simple fact is that if we're on a path to 4 degrees of warming, we get to a point by about 2080 where we really cannot adapt to that. Life becomes extremely unpleasant, not only in countries in Africa, but actually here as well. So you know, this is absolutely critical to all of us. Actually, in our survey of both our survey of people who chose to participate and our survey of people who were selected to give us a broader view, everybody was very keen on communication and education and helping them understand better what the right courses of action to take. Because as you highlight, it's complicated. You do need to do quite a lot of analysis sometimes to understand whether it is the best route to refurbish an existing building or to knock it down and start again. So we do need to be able to do that analysis, and we do need to do that analysis to actually establish what the right solution to the problem is in many cases. So I think you raise some very interesting points there that do require thinking about. But one of the things we were very struck by was how much the residents of the region wanted to play their part, and both in the people who signed up to take the survey and, as I say, the people who were selected to give us a better cross-sectional of the different communities in the region. They all wanted to play their part, and they all wanted more education and more understanding of the situation.
Thank you very much, Baroness.
No. Councillor Fane.
Thank you. My question is to some extent a follow-up to what Councillor Corney was asking about, and I was very reassured, Baroness Brown, by your response in relation to the need to connect heat pumps with solar. I focus on this area because you said it is one of the most intractable, how we meet the heat needs, and of course one where we as local councils, there is most that we can do, particularly in respect of new houses. And I'm encouraged that there will still be a continuing role for local councils in setting standards, at least for the moment, in terms of the government response to the future home standards. Let's leave that open to us. I think you were absolutely right to, I think if I'm representing you correctly, to be a little wary about hydrogen for the moment, and that does rather bring us back to heat pumps. I just wanted to ask you, there seems to be a lot of variation between different types of heat pumps and the variation in the COP, the efficiency of those heat pumps. There is a challenge for, if we're going to see greater reliance on ground source, even in some cases water source rather than air source, it tends for most of us to be something that is more easily done as part of a district network. Very few of us have the scope to actually put the area of slinkies in our gardens that we might need. And I'm just wondering what we as local councils can do to encourage greater uptake of ground source heat pumps on a community basis, if indeed the Commission sees that as a suitable solution.
Well, I think one of the recommendations is that we do think there needs to be a lot more thinking and planning of local heat network solutions in key areas. I mean, we haven't gone to the detail of saying which are the key areas, but we do think that's an important part of the solution, as you highlight. And having had an air source heat pump which is the size of a small wardrobe installed in my garden, I absolutely recognise that not everybody has got space, and indeed in many areas that wouldn't be visually acceptable around our cities and things. So that there have to be other solutions. There are also some new technologies coming through. There was reports in the news last week of a microwave system, which although is not as efficient as a heat pump, is much more, has an initial installation cost which is much closer to, and a size which is much closer to a conventional boiler. So there is some further technology coming on, and in some ways the first thing we need to concentrate on is getting the insulation standards up such that these low carbon heat solutions can be cost effective for people. I think there's an enormous amount to do in the next 5 to 10 years, actually, almost more on making sure we get people's homes and our buildings up to the kind of installation standards that these new technologies will work in. But I think you're absolutely right. I think consulting with appropriate communities about heat pump based community heat systems is a very good idea, and we would encourage that, and we have a specific mention of that in the report.
Indeed, thank you. There's a scheme that the County Council is working with residents in Swaffham Prior, which has been very complex to do, but which is a very exciting early exemplar of that, being promoted through by a community land trust who initiated the idea. And I know there's another project getting underway in Huntingdonshire as well. So
I hope we've got a box about the Swaffham Prior scheme. I can't find it just at the moment, but we've certainly heard about it, and we're very encouraged to hear the commitment that was going into developing it.
Yeah, excellent. And finally, Councillor Miscandlon.
Thank you very much.
A long time now is your moment.
I have voted very hard. I live in the Fens, and you've got a section on the peatlands, which affects where I live. The one thing I would say is you've got an established or funding in the order of £50,000 a year for a period of 5 years. What's the timescale for this? Is it endless, or for the peatland investigation? The second thing is mileage between where I live and my nearest suitable shopping area is 8 miles. That isn't going to change. So what could I do to reduce my mileage? Do more shops in a week, which is not the practice these days. So therefore, the chance of me reducing the mileage is quite difficult. The other thing is, say, about roads. Whittlesey Town Council, who I also sit on, have just instigated a report from Royal Haskin to put a relief road round Whittlesea. Now, the reason for this is to reduce the pollution through Whittlesea through heavy commercial vehicles. 2 days later, from receiving the report from Royal Haskin, we have a planning application to import 250,000 tonnes of bottom waste via heavy lorries through the town. So we need to look at that. And on a slightly positive note, and there are some very positive things in the report, Whittlesea Town Council has just installed 2 charging points which are free to use for the public because they're being run off solar panels on the roof of the council offices in Whittlesea. So we're ahead of the game on that because they're the 2 first public charging points in Fenland. Thank you very much.
Well, that's excellent news because we were very concerned that the Fens has a very, very low proportion of charging points per head of population at the moment, and we would like to see all areas brought up to the average level, and say Fenland is particularly poorly served at the moment. The other thing is that I had thought that the mileage, the driving miles per head in Fenland might be particularly high because of course it is an area where public transport is challenging.
Yep.
But actually you're not the sinners, so to speak, in Fenland. If you look at the analysis in the report, you are about at the average, and there are other areas have much higher car miles per head. So I don't think you need to feel too guilty. But if you can do anything to reduce your mileage, that would be good. But we do absolutely recognise that for some areas, the eventual the way of reducing emissions will be an eventual transition to low emission vehicles, because there will be areas where public transport isn't going to be cost effective. Although we would like to see an acceleration of the trials of on-demand bus services for people in those areas. But we do recognise that very much that there will still be a need to travel by car, particularly in some areas, and you're one of them. So we have tried to address the different circumstances of different parts of the region, which you rightly highlight.
The time scale for the peatland investigation.
Oh, sorry. Well, we're hoping that it's about to get going, and that we will soon have news that it can get going. And it may not take 5 years. I agree. It's about getting things up and running. It's about having the right information to feed in to the national survey of peat, which is not coming till 2023. So we can be ahead of that. In terms of understanding what the regional situation is and developing best practice, and making sure our farmers are best positioned to apply to the new environmental land management scheme, ELMS, and the other schemes that will encourage things like peat restoration.
Okay.
So it may not need to go on for 5 years. That was but I think there's certainly 3 years of probably of work that need to be done.
Yeah, because no one at this moment in time knows how much peat there is there.
Absolutely,
and what type,
yes.
And what type of peat there is there. And the farmers that talk to me say, well, we haven't got any peat on our land, but it's still classified as peat land.
And that's its first objective, is to start the analysis to understand what peat there actually is, what types of peat, where it's heavily degraded and things. Yes, yeah, we need to establish that clearly.
And on a matter of house efficiency, I live in a house that was constructed in 1849 with 18-inch thick walls, which is very, very thermally efficient. Once it gets warm, it stays warm. But once it gets cold, it stays cold.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody, for a very interesting set of questions, and thank you, Baroness Brown, for a particularly informative and helpful set of answers. I think this is an incredibly exciting piece of work that is going to rightly go on, and which we'll want to keep a close eye on and involvement with. So thank you enormously for making time in your no doubt very busy schedule to come and talk to us today. Thank you to Adrian and to Paul for being on hand in case you were needed, and we look forward to following the progress of this over the coming months and years, and no doubt to seeing you again.
Well, good luck with your scrutiny. Thank you very much.
Thank you enormously. Right, so we move on then to our next item, which is the COVID-19 impact paper, and we should have John T. Hill joining us for that. So we'll wait and see whether indeed he does. Oh, we have Domenico as well. And Patrick White. So, good morning. Good morning, John.
Good morning, Chair.
Pleased to have you with us.
Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you okay. We've met Domenico before. We also have Patrick White with us, whom I don't think we've met.
Yes, I'm going to introduce Patrick. He's
Marvellous.
a director with Metro Dynamics who've done the work for us. But I'll give you a quick intro, and then over to Patrick, and then to questions if that suits you.
Fabulous. Thank you very much indeed.
So, members, this March version of the local economic recovery strategy has benefited from much more data from Patrick and his colleagues at Metro Dynamics on the impacts of COVID onto our economy. It's also had in-depth feedback from each local authority, from the business organisations, FSB, Chambers, CBI, and of course the local organisations like Opportunity Peterborough and Cambridge Ahead. We've had the business board do a couple of workshops and included the employer skills board in that. And we've cross-checked it against the recovery strategies that the other LEPs in the ARCS-CAM ARC have produced to make sure that we're not missing anything that they've picked up. And critically, given the last presentation, we've also included responses to the Climate Commission's recommendations. What we've heard is that there are increased inequalities and an increased need for levelling up, and that this second wave hit our economy much harder than the first wave. We've also seen that there are increased opportunities for regrowth to bake in the behavioural changes that will green our economy, as well as the shifts in market and government policy that will hopefully do the same. So with that, I'll hand over to Patrick to tell a little bit more before we go to questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chair. Thanks very much, John. Just want to not going to speak for very long at all because I'm conscious of time, and it'd be better to leave more space for questions. But a couple of things just to draw out and maybe emphasise from what John said. So the first is that you set your recovery strategy up to be a live document, which is absolutely right, and the proof of that, if you like, is in just how much the situation has changed now from even when you last looked at this in November, and that it is continuing to change. So this is not the final word on this, and that's hugely important also because of the relationship between COVID and Brexit, and trying to disentangle those two, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a second, and also to the kind of emerging government kind of funding and policy position about which we know more than we did in November. So I think a couple of things just to kind of say about your emerging recovery strategy. I think the first is that it's is really important to be clear about, as you are always, but about the different needs and opportunities in the different parts of your economy and how they interrelate, and how for your economy to recover successfully, all parts of it need to be supported in different ways, and it has been affected in different ways across your patch. And that's kind of, it's stating the obvious to people like you who know your your places extremely well, but it's really important to set that out in the context for kind of seeking government investment and support for what you're trying to do. So we've tried to do that in the draft that is in front of you. I think the second thing is just to emphasise, and the previous conversation is deeply relevant. Two things. First is just how big a role the different parts of your economy has to play in securing the UK's transition to a zero carbon economy. It's important everywhere, but because of the strengths you have, whether that's manufacturing and engineering assets in Peterborough, or the kind of assets and economy in the Fens, or kind of Cambridge, all three of them together have a huge role to play in what the UK has to do next. And that tells you something else, which is just the way the context facing businesses, the context facing people in the labour market is changing very, very, very rapidly and in ways that we don't yet fully understand. And that plays out in your interventions, which are very focused on skills and retraining and ensuring that businesses and people have the kind of support they need to flex and to be able to deal with a whole set of changes which are running through the economy and are going to continue to run through. And we don't know exactly what capital investment you're going to need in 5 years' time. It's impossible to figure that out. So what this plan does is to set the context, set those changes out, and then to talk about a set of actions, some of which are things you're taking now to deal with the kind of immediate COVID kind of impact on businesses and kind of business survival, and then to look into the kind of 22-23 period and say, here are some of the longer term things which we're going to need to bid for from the Levelling Up Fund and the Shared Prosperity Fund and so on. A word on Brexit. Frustratingly, it is just too early to tell in the data at a local level what the differences are between, if you like, the things that are going on in your economy, which you can directly link to the trade deal that was, came into force in January, and then things that are going on anyway. We've got national level trade data, but it's a slump in January, which is a point in time, and it's too early to disaggregate that out at local level. As you get into kind of end of May, June, we will be able to see that in a bit more detail, and it will be easier to kind of pinpoint the specific emerging impacts of that trade agreement. But it's too early to tell, kind of as we sit here, kind of at the end of March. I think it's worth saying that the employment impacts have essentially been masked by the furlough scheme and the business support schemes. They will start to kind of appear as those schemes end, if they do, as we get into kind of later in the summer. It's definitely worth saying that on almost whichever measure you pick, unemployment, worklessness across your patch has gone up, and it's gone up in particular in relation to young people and relation to women, partly because those groups are very heavily represented in leisure and hospitality sectors, but those trends appear to be slightly stronger in your patch than elsewhere. So you do have and you apparently have a kind of youth unemployment problem, which looks like it's going up faster than the rest of the country, but it's really hard to draw firm conclusions about that at the moment because of the employment support scheme, and we'll keep a very close eye on that with John and colleagues over the course of the period ahead. I think I'll leave it there, Chair, and obviously very happy to take any questions from elected members on any of the detail in the papers.
Thank you very much indeed, both of you. Members, do you have any questions? I'm seeing a hand from Councillor Murphy.
Thank you, and thanks for the presentation. I'm looking on the coloured charts that show our interventions rather than the government ones, and I was wondering if you could explain a little bit more. The local economic recovery, we talk about it being a live action, therefore we can evaluate it in real time and change it. So I was wondering if you could maybe explain to us some of the refocusing that's happened taking into account the information and how we've decided to do things a different way that have worked particularly good, and maybe one or two that maybe we shouldn't have ploughed on with that or haven't worked particularly well, just to give it some reality. You know, if you could talk about these young people, if you could talk about money we've moved from one project to another. And I've also looked at the narrative in those charts about the Peterborough University and the inferences that some of the things that we want to do or we want to be done at phase 2 in particular are building based. They can't be done over the internet remotely, whereas it was all being sold as though this was going to be a remote university. And I'm wondering if we're prepared to say, look, this is a bit of a mess. It's not going to contribute to recovery, and let's pull it and stop building on the embankment and do things that are of benefit to people rather than ploughing on with the same old that hasn't worked. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Councillor Murphy. Yes, so as an example of flexing the interventions from the version of the strategy before Christmas to now, and particularly with the intervention or of the new funding, levelling up, and the Communities Renewal Fund, we've put more effort into coming up with a short-term program to help get young people into skills and young people into jobs. And we are right now building a bid to the Communities Renewal Fund that we hope will be 1.5 to 2 million. It will go in June 18th. It will run for a very fast and intensive 1.5 million between September and March, and will be about boots on the ground that are helping young people and engaging young people that have been affected, and also other people that have been displaced by unemployment, and either get them into jobs or get them into education to then also get them into jobs later. So that's something that is a new intervention that we haven't really thought of last year. Very intensive and very quick, and hopefully very impactful in that. I think the other thing that we've changed is when during the response period, local authorities gave away revenue grants to basically just pay rent and just keep businesses going. The combined authority put around £4 million into capital grants, but very quick response grants. What we are also preparing a bid for again the Communities Renewal Fund for June is an entrepreneurs startup grant. There will be lots of people that have been displaced, and frankly, in the short term, 9 months or so, there isn't enough jobs for them because we haven't regrown those jobs yet. So what we've thought of is a startup grant, because some people may not be able to get another job, but they may actually start their own business as a sole trader or something like that as an alternative. So they're two examples for how we've changed interventions on the fly, over the last 3 months based on the new data. As for the university in Peterborough, it has a 50% higher off-campus learning percentage than most of the universities. It's around 60%, and if I think it's about 66%. So at any one time, actually, there's less than half the people who are studying that are actually present in the university, and that's not counting that obviously some students don't go 5 days a week. So it is a very in-company and remote model for a university. So yes, the first building we're building has got the capacity to train or teach 3,000 students, 3,000 graduates, but actually present in the building at any one time is probably going to be something like 300, maybe 350. So yes, it is concrete, but we've leveraged that amount of concrete really heavily to minimise how big a lump of concrete we need to build.
Thank you very much indeed. I've got 3 more questioners, and I'm going to need to ask people to be brief because we have got only 40 minutes to cover the rest of our agenda. So if you could keep your questions brief to John T. Hill, that would be very helpful. Markus, Councillor Gehring.
Yes, hello. Yeah, I found the report very helpful. I had a question on page 50 of our agenda and page 35 of the report. There's the £100 million investment in housing. Given the scandalous withdrawal of the rest of the funding, I was wondering whether we can still count that towards the recovery. I also note it's somehow rated at 1 and 2 on its potential impact, whereas the same program for the city has 2 green boxes under number 24 on its impact for recover, rebound, and renew and future growth. So can you explain this discrepancy between the 2 impacts? Is it where the housing is built? And then shouldn't we actually change as to how we build housing in the combined authority?
Thank you, Markus.
So I'll take the first question, if I may, Councillor Gehring, and hand the second one to Patrick. On the first one, this report went to publication because it's been through the Business Board, the Skills Committee, before we got the letter from government around the 100 million housing investment program. So yes, line 15 it represents the situation as was before that happened. So apologies for that, and we'll correct that next time. Patrick, can you answer the discrepancy between how we rated that and how we rated item number 24?
Yeah, absolutely, and I'll sort of take this away and check it, Councillor, as well as giving you an answer now, if you see what I mean. So thanks for pointing it out. There are 2 things, I think. The first is that just in terms of the impact on recovery, I think it is not likely to be very large in the very short term because it's a longer term program. So that's a facet of timing rather than anything else for line 15. I think the difference between the kind of the reds and the orange and then the greens on 24 is that the what we scored in 24 was a kind of wider set of thinking and a wider set of proposals about the kind of planning and housing strategy in total, not just 100 million. But I agree it looks a little bit odd. So we'll go away and just have a little check to make sure. I'm confident about the timing point, but I need to just be sure about what we're actually including in it. So I'll take that away and have a look. Thank you.
Thank you very much for pointing that out, Councillor Gehring. Councillor Scutt.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the report. Now, I really can't resist. Patrick, you've got such a famous name. I suppose that you know that your name, yeah, after a Nobel Prize winner. It was lovely to see. Now, what I will come quickly to my question, Chair. It relates to the unemployment of women and the high impact on women and women's jobs of the COVID-19. Now, you did mention, John, the hospitality industry, but it's notable that women are mainly involved in the care industry, childcare, adult care and aged care, and also feature highly in health education and libraries, for example. So I'm wondering in relation to that, because notably the Cambridgeshire County Council, in its budget for the forthcoming period, put all the money into highways. Now, if we're thinking seriously about reconstruction, recovery and renewal, it would seem to me, with the greatest respect, that some of the money should have been put into the care industry, because highways generates jobs that are traditionally seen as male jobs, whereas the care industry traditionally would impact on jobs that are mainly taken by women. So all I'm saying is, please, in relation to recovery, reconstruction and renewal and women's jobs, concentrate beyond the hospitality industry to those other industries. But the final point I'd like to make is this, that I was interested, John, to hear you refer to entrepreneurial startup grants, and I do hope that particular concentration would be registered in that area, because it is it is reflected in research that women are generally far better at setting up small business enterprises, at sustaining them and at making them successful. So please, in those startup grants, have real attention paid to women's entrepreneurial capacities and the fact that they are generally seen from the research as far better at sustaining small business. Thanks, John.
Thank you, Councillor Scutt. I'll just respond on a couple of points, as well as the extra £1.5 million of startup grants that we're going to try and get hold of from the Communities Renewal Fund. We do already have £4.5 million of growth coaching grants for scale-ups of companies rather than startups, and we've got another £6 million of investment for growth in companies. And I can also agree with you and tell you that our strategy for targeting the companies, the scale-ups to help, has shifted as a result of this report. And yes, we would expect to be targeting, because of the displacement of women that is larger, hospitality, care and education. So we would do that. On your point about enterprise and women in startups, I can also say that part of our targeting is to look at targeting of potential scale-ups that can scale most, and hence we get best impact from the support we give. We've looked at a number of characteristics of potential scale-ups, and one of them is a woman on the board is more likely to denote a scale-up company than one without. So we agree.
Let's hope more women on the board than one. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Councillor Hay, you're the last questioner on this.
Thank you, Chairman. I have a question about on page 30 of the report. It mentions about universal credit, and in the south of the district, Cambridge and South Cambridgeshire, it's 7 out of 100 and 9 out of 100 respectively, whereas in Fenland, 24 people out of 100 are receiving universal credit. This has gone up at 103% from March last year to November. What plans, if any, has the combined authority got specifically to help the areas who suffer the most deprivation come out of the recovery from COVID?
Thank you, Councillor Hay. I'll pass over to Patrick to talk about the numbers, but just in terms of what we're doing, just as this information has encouraged us and pointed us to look at firms that may benefit female employees in their growth more. It also, as in my introduction, I did say that the second wave has increased inequality and has increased the need for levelling up even more. So that would also follow through in the targeting of our scale-up support, again, into Fenland where the need is greatest, but also within new programmes. Another programme that we're hoping to apply for the Communities Renewal fund is to support a manufacturing cluster in Finland. There's already a really quite impressive advanced manufacturing cluster there, especially around Chatteris. But we really do believe that it's one that can be expanded and create a lot of jobs. So we are focusing on Finland because we can see the impacts have been worse.
It's probably worth saying, just to add, that of course those impacts are worse in a place where people were already suffering lower wages and therefore more likely to be on universal credit while still in work. So this issue about low wages and in work poverty, which is one of the things that universal credit hides, is feeding through into these numbers. So it makes the actions that John has talked about in terms of reskilling and trying to drive up wage levels, as well as helping people back into work, if you see what I mean, doubly important. So you're seeing both those factors, I think, play out in the universal credit numbers in Finland.
Thank you, that's encouraging.
Great. Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you enormously to John and to Patrick and also to Domenico for being with us as well this morning. Good to see you again and look forward to seeing you again at this committee in its next incarnation after May. Thank you all very much indeed. That's been very useful. Right, I'm keen to press on as we have a number of items still to conclude by 1 o'clock, which is when I would like to conclude this meeting. So can we move on to the CAM Task and Finish Group update, please? Councillor Davey, you're on.
I'll be very brief, Chair. The report's short and self-explanatory, really, and I would recommend that we follow the recommendations. That's dreadful tautology. I would suggest we follow the recommendations as outlined, namely that we close the current task group as it currently stands and post the election, set up another group with revised terms of reference. The budget and the significance of the task of the CAM is huge, and I think it requires its own separate little group to review progress. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed. I would support that too. Councillor Gehring.
Yeah, I completely agree. I'm very concerned about the level of scrutiny that we can possibly exercise with regards to the independent delivery vehicle, but we will continue to try that. I think there's a slight mistake in the report, because I distinctly remember that we discussed East-West Rail, not South-East Transport, when we discussed the Camborne to Cambridge, kind of how that aligns with the Chem Metro system. Perhaps we can just add East-West Rail into that mix.
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor Gehring. Councillor Davey, do you want to confirm that?
I'm happy to confirm what Councillor Gehring just said.
Okay, excellent. So with that clarification then, are we happy to accept the recommendations? Good, thank you enormously. So we now move on to item 8, which is the Combined Authorities Project Register, and we should have Roberta Fulton joining us for that. You will see this time that we've got this in a new format, and I hope you will agree that it is a considerable improvement on the previous format in giving us a lot more information about the status of these projects, their timescales and where they're all going. So welcome, Roberta, good to have you with us again. Is there anything you would like to say to us in connection with your report on the project register?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, councillors. Yeah, as you mentioned, this is just the new update in its current form. This is based on the request from councillors at the end of last year that we provided more information. So as you can see, this now contains the RAG status, a comparison of RAG status and the completion date of our projects. This information will be coming from the monthly Combined Authority Highlight Report process. The data in front of you is from the February highlight reports. Going forward, the comparison column will be a comparison of the reports at the overview and scrutiny update. As this is the first one, though, the comparison is against the January highlight reports. In terms of the completion dates, this will vary with projects. The definition In some instances, that will be the completion date of the entire project, whereas for others, it will be the gateway stage completion date instead. There are 3 new projects as part of this update, which is the Business Growth Service, the Community Land Trust project, and the A141 transport project. And there's also been a number of projects that have closed, which will be at the back end of the appendix. I believe that's all I was going to offer in the introduction, but I'm happy to take any questions or.
Thank you very much indeed, Roberta. I've got a couple of questions myself. The first one, I'm assuming that for the 100 million affordable housing programme, HOUS 001, that completion date of 2022 is going to be revised, as it's quite clearly 2021. So I'm assuming that that's just a lag in the information coming through. Am I correct in that?
Yes. So again, these reports were based for February, so they were due in about 4 weeks ago. So obviously, any changes to that programme will be updated in the March highlight reports.
And presumably similarly, HOUS 007, the 100k homes is noted as ongoing, assuming once again that I believe the funding for that from government sources will have stopped with the withdrawal of the £45 million. So,
and yeah, changes to that one will be updated in the March highlight reports accordingly.
Quite so. And just finally from me, in the closed projects, the Rural Community Energy Fund, it says not a CPCA project to be managed separately. Does that mean it was a CPCA project and is no longer because it's been taken over or handed over or something? Briefly, what's the story behind that?
Yes, so it might just be the definition. That's just the way that we report on it. It was reported as separate projects individually. That was then put on hold when it was likely that the energy hub would be transferred out. We are now going to, combined authority will remain as the accountable body. But what we are going to do is we're going to reassess the reporting of the energy hub. So we're going to close on those 2 now, which are the existing projects. But there will be another project coming through. We're in discussions with the energy hub team now.
Oh, right. So this is in connection with the report that's going to board on Wednesday about taking over and then handing over and then taking back the whole energy hub. Right. Okay, with you.
So you'll see a new report. Yeah, perfect.
Got it. Marvellous. I've got one question from Councillor Murphy. Oh, and one from Councillor Gehring after that. Councillor Murphy.
Yes, thank you. I previously asked about the management and administration costs of some of our projects. I was wondering how much work that would take for it to come forward. Obviously, some projects are going to have different management and administration costs than others. I was told that it's all in there. It's all done sort of centrally and we haven't worked it out. I think it might be helpful. For example, if we knew on project A, it was costing 10% in administration and management, and in project B, it was costing 2%. We could maybe evaluate and scrutinize a bit better, because sometimes we can spend an awful lot of money on bureaucracy and administration when it's very beneficial, and sometimes when it's no beneficial whatsoever. And on how much would it cost to do, would it be within the current capacity of yourselves and your colleagues? If you can't answer this question, please say, or would it cost us a lot more to do climate assessments of our projects? We've had the Commission report recently, and I think we'll be moving towards that. For example, you mentioned today there's 3 new projects come on board. That work may have already been done, but it hasn't been called a climate assessment. It may be called something else. But I'm just wondering, in order to help us change the behaviour and get us more focused on the climate emergency, what would you think about doing climate assessments of new projects as they come forward?
I mean, Councillor Dupre can answer or try to answer that question. All of our projects go through an initiation process. They have required to complete an internal project initiation document before they go to board for the relevant approval. The terms of actually that climate assessment, I'm probably not the best person to ask, but I can do a bit of investigation and provide an update to Councillor Murphy if that would help on the actual climate side of it.
Right, okay. Councillor Murphy, do you have a response to that?
Be able to take that away and work out how you can do the climate assessments and advise your directors and your chief executive and monitoring officer of any resources you'll need for that. And also, if you could just double check on the management and admin charges, whether we can have some evaluation of that as well, please.
That's something, there's a whole work stream effectively that we can pick up, or that this committee can pick up in the next cycle, I'm sure. Councillor, I seem to have a forest of hands now. Councillor Gehring, briefly, please.
Just a really quick question. I thought the one CAM Limited was now responsible for the outline business case. We still have the CAM Metro as a combined authority project, but with no date for the completion, and with now Kim Sawyer responsible rather than the head of transport. Can you just explain why there's no date, or how the interaction will work for the outline business case?
Oh, sorry. I can get some additional information on that. Like I said, that's just come from the February highlight report, but I can speak to the CAM team about the reason there is no date and provide an update on that one for you.
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Sharp.
Thank you, Chairman. Like yourself, I welcome the additional information we're getting, but this is the problem: when you get more information, you tend to ask more questions.
True.
And I'm just, I think some of the completion dates are slightly misleading, because if I look at the A47 dueling, it's saying 31st October. Now, I believe that Department for Transport are taking a lot of that work on. So, and similarly, sustainable travel, 1st of April, and there's another one, 31st of May. Could it be that it's at that stage of the report? Because if I look at the one for the A141 Huntingdon, that mentions the strategic outline business case, that's the end of that stage, and then it obviously moves on to the next stage. So it might be useful on these, just, you know, if it's purely the completion of the business case, and that would be helpful from my point of view, to look at it. I don't know how other members feel. And the only other thing is the movement of, and again, I know we're conscious of time, so I won't ask for the answer now, but in terms of the movement of the RAG rating on the March Junction improvements, and also the Wisbech access strategy at some stage would be useful. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much. Roberta, are you going to take those away, or do you have anything for us at the moment on those?
Yeah, no, I can get, so that's a change in the RAG for the March and the
Thank you. So I'm conscious of time.
37 and 48. Yep. Okay. Thank you very much. Right. I think that concludes us on this then. So you've got some things to come back to this committee on, Roberta, in the fullness of time, which will be in the summer now. But we're all very grateful for the additional information on this, even as Councillor Sharp says, even if it results in more questions. But I think that's useful to know. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Roberta. Thanks. Okay, moving on then to the Combined Authority Board agenda, where we're going to need to think about what questions we would like to ask. Councillor Sharp, you have a legacy hand, I think. Can I just turn us to, I think that there are probably going to be perhaps a maximum of 4 areas where we're going to want to ask questions. So to cut this to the chase a bit, I think those areas are 2.2, financial strategies, 3.1 CAM progress report, possibly 3.6 climate change report, and 5.1 on the affordable housing programme. Does anybody feel they need us to ask a question on anything other than those 4 items? Okay. Should we take them in turn then, because that's a sort of a logical thing to do? 2.2, the financial strategies. I was wondering whether we might want to ask in the Treasury strategy a question about what plans, if any, the Combined Authority has to move towards decarbonising its investments. Is that a question we would want to ask, and in that simple a form? Does anybody have any views on that? Happy for me to ask that on Wednesday? Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Lorna.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Sorry,
all right.
Councillor Miss Chamberlain.
It's all right. It could be existing projects that are ongoing. Can anything be done to insert climate change, not regulations, climate change issues that would mitigate into that project? So, you know, they've got a project online. Is there anything that minimally could be done to enhance it in climate change terms?
Right, okay. I think this is more about financial management than particularly project management, but I think
Yeah, obviously
asking a wider question about is there anything they're already doing?
Yeah, obviously if they do that, there is financial implications. And have they had a look at that?
Okay, I'm sure we can work up something on that. Are we happy with that revised question along those lines then? Yes. Good. Okay. CAM progress report. I think Councillor Davey, you had some thoughts on that.
Forgive me, Chair, I forgot to unmute myself. I think that there's ongoing discussions in relation to the budget, which I think probably doesn't need to, but I think within that report, section 6.5 gives details about the appointment of the chief executive and senior staff. And I think from a scrutiny position, we should ask two things, really. I think, first of all, welcome comparative data on salaries of equivalent chief executives for similar projects. But secondly, bearing in mind that 50% and an additional 50% to £250,000 salary is proposed to go on performance-related pay, it would be useful to see the criteria that they're going to assess the new chief executive on that, and also, as it's a third for the other two, what the criteria is for how they will also be managed, particularly the finance officer, if I'm honest. Because I would have thought the finance officer's main objective is to make sure the finance is right. I can't quite see what the extra bits are there, but that's maybe me being trite. But anyway, something along those two elements, please, Lorna.
So it's the criteria for how the performance element is assessed.
Yeah. Bearing in mind the level because that would amount to, for the chief executive, a further £125,000.
Right, okay, thank you for that. Councillor Murphy, is that a fresh
Yeah,
hand?
yeah, it is a little bit more forceful on this. I think we should ask, do not the board not agree that these remuneration terms are absolutely outrageous? If you compare it to any ratio, and it's a unicorn project and somebody's just taking the Michael here seriously, but it's big money and it's absolutely outrageous.
I think that's why I'd like to know what comparative projects are paid, Ed. That would be the starting point, I think.
The audacity of bringing this to what's supposed to be a professional organisation servicing the public just shows, you know, I suppose some people might call it corruption or incompetence, but it's absolutely outrageous.
Let's be a little bit cautious here. I think we're right to go for the facts in the first instance and get the information. I'm not sure it's up to us to express our views as an alternative board. I think what we're here to do is ask the questions that scrutinise what's happening. So I think if we could stick with that, that would be helpful. Councillor Chamberlain.
Chair, very briefly, can we come back to getting some sort of confirmation of the funding of this and where the money's coming from and what security there is in the funding for the entire project? Thanks.
I'm happy to put that in as a question. I think that would be a useful exercise as well. So we've got a three-part exercise around that if we're happy. Are we happy with that?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you very much. 3.6 on the climate change. I don't know whether anybody had any burning questions arising out of this morning's presentation that they felt it was useful to ask the board at this stage, bearing in mind the board itself will be considering the report and its implications, and there are some recommendations in there. I was inclined to ask whether you will remember some 18 months ago the mayor declined to declare a climate emergency at our invitation. And I was wondering whether we might want to ask whether the interim report had in any way affected his view on that, because I think if we're going to have a climate cabinet chaired by the mayor, it would be useful to know where the existing mayor stands on the issue of climate change and the climate emergency. I see a couple of hands up. Councillor Gehring first.
Yeah, perhaps we could note that there are some urgent recommendations that the Combined Authority could implement right away if it wanted. And I was a little bit worried by the introduction we received and the answers we received from officers saying, oh, it's just in the process. We don't know which one we're going to follow, which one we're not following. I think this needs to be an open and transparent process. If the Independent Climate Commission recommends something and then the board decides to completely go against that recommendation, it undermines.
So Councillor Gehring, your question to the board would be what?
How will the process of full implementation how will the process of full implementation of the report of the Climate Commission be managed, and how do we ensure transparent decision making on that if important recommendations are just dropped by the board?
Right, okay. Councillor Davey.
Thank you, Lorna. I bow to Alex and the other Fenland councillors on this one, but I think we should be asking something about peat, shouldn't we? And particularly about the liaison between the farmers and the how, given that the Baroness said that 45% of our emissions come from the peat, I mean, implications are therefore quite massive, but also nationally massive, because the Fens is where most of the spuds in the country are grown. It seems to me to be, it would be wrong not to ask something around that, particularly as we will be scrutinising how that's taken forward. And I thought the initial liaison with the farming community is probably where I would want to start to get the information.
Right, I mean, one of the recommendations going to the board is to establish this special committee with its work on peat, which I think is probably the sensible way to go on that. And I'm sure that will want to consider a very active programme of consultation with relevant stakeholders. I would hope so, and I think we would have something to say if it didn't. But yes, Councillor Miscandlin.
Yeah, I support that. I think it's imperative that this new climate change committee, or whatever you want to call it, whatever title they give, I think it's absolutely vitally important they do consult with the farmers, because I can tell you at this moment in time, they aren't consulting with the farmers. Nobody's consulting with the farmers. They're just issuing edicts. So I think it's vitally important that they do talk to the farmers, because I think there's a lot of anger out there with what they're getting at the moment from the media and from other sources. And I think that needs to be allayed by this committee, new committee, talking to them. And I think it's very important.
Thank you very much. So we've got a number of issues that we have surfaced here. Firstly, I think, are we happy to ask a question about the mayor and the climate emergency, firstly? I'm not seeing any dissent. Okay.
Lorna, what exactly was the question you were going to ask with regard to the mayor?
The question was that about 18 months ago, we as a committee invited the mayor, asked him whether he was going to declare a climate emergency, whether the Combined Authority was going to declare a climate emergency. He said no, he wasn't. Subsequently to that, this commission was established. And it has now produced its first interim report. The question would be, having read the interim report, has the mayor changed his view on the nature of the climate emergency?
Right.
The second set of issues around about management and transparency, and I think there is an issue there, certainly with the establishment of a climate cabinet, and we might want to ask how open and transparent that climate cabinet will be in its decision making, how much access to information the Scrutiny Committee will have about that, and how much will be in the public domain, and how it will go about prioritising the actions from the interim report. Does that seem a question we would want to ask? Yeah? Okay. And the third one, I think, though my internet dropped out a bit, was specifically around the issue of peat. So did we want to ask, I think there's question, the concern seems to be about public engagement with that, and engagement particularly with farmers. So did we want to ask a question about the engagement of the Combined Authority and of the Climate Commission with its new committee on peat, and how it will engage with stakeholders and particularly the farming community? Does that seem a question we would want to ask? Councillor Corney, your hand is up.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think my take, I think it's really important that we highlight the issue of it. But I think, in fairness, Baroness Brown made it quite clear that I think they're saying that this is one of the first things they need to address themselves. I think they admitted that anyway. So,
yeah.
I mean, we're sort of putting the horse in front of the, sort of in front or behind the cart, if you like. But that's my take on that.
I think that's right. There is a lot of work to be done, and Baroness Brown was the first to acknowledge that. But I think the question I was trying to formulate was, how will they engage with people they need to engage with in doing that work as they go forward? Councillor Murphy.
Yes, it might be helpful to ask the question in a nice sort of way, asking them what steps they'll be taking to engage with the farmers, the National Farmers Union, and the tenant farmers that there are for the county and Peterborough Council.
I certainly wasn't intending for us to ask it in anything other than a nice way. There's nothing for us to be aggressive about here. So are we happy with those questions? Okay, thanks. And then we come to the affordable housing programme. And I think there were a number of questions. Certainly, I think we were wanting to ask about the concept, the extraordinary concept that a member of the board would be told that they would need to submit a freedom of information request to see correspondence between the Combined Authority and the Minister. Councillor Scutt, your hand is up. You're our lead member on housing.
Yeah. I think we do need to pursue the question of sources of other funding. If I go to the, let me see, I've got copied out from the business case and from the Combined Authority Agreement. Now, in the Combined Authority Agreement, what it says is, under the heading New Homes and Sustainable Communities, paragraph 14 refers to the Combined Authority with partner authorities will use the power and infrastructure resources devolved from central government alongside public and private investment to significantly increase housing delivery. At paragraph 17, it says, amongst other things, it's talking about proposals to fund the infrastructure and so forth of the housing through devolved infrastructure funds, through national programs and through local funding. And then the business case provides in the executive summary, paragraph 1, talking about how to deliver the housing scheme. This will include bringing together funding streams secured through the devolution agreement with other investments and the funds secured through growth deals. And then in paragraph 2.1, under paragraph 2, the commercial case, it refers to the CPCA, the GP Enterprise Partnership, and the private sector will work together strategically with a single plan and approach to deliver the housing schemes. This will include bringing together...
Councillor Scutt, can I interrupt? We are running short of time and I don't want members to leave and leave us in quorate. So if you could cut to the question you want to ask, I think that would be very helpful.
If I'd been allowed to continue, this will include bringing together funding streams secured through the devolution agreement with other investments and the funds secured through growth deals. The question therefore needs to be, in my humble opinion, this. The Combined Authority Agreement and the business case indicates that the Combined Authority was to seek funding to supplement the 100 million for the housing received from government. What, if any, steps have been taken by the combined authority in accordance with this requirement? And if steps have been taken, please provide a dated list, the outcome, and what funding has been secured and what funding is programmed to be secured in the future. And may I add this, Chair, I am always extremely brief and concise in my questions, and any perusal of this this recording will indicate that. And so I would appreciate the opportunity to simply conclude what I was seeking to say. And if you add up how many words I've expended throughout the entirety of this meeting, you will find that my use of time has been extremely small in relation to many others. Thank you.
Are we happy to ask Councillor Scutt's question? Thank you very much. The other questions I think we ought to ask is, firstly, the report to the board talks about the completion of the £100 million project. I don't see anything anywhere which suggests that that project will complete a £100 million scheme. And therefore I'd like to try and probe that a little bit by asking whether the board believes that the £100 million programme will be completed, in the sense of having 2,000 houses built and £100 million spent on it. And the other question I thought we might want to ask is, what is their expected best case and worst case for the amount of money that will be spent on this affordable housing programme by March 2022, and the number of homes that will be built? Are we happy to ask that set of questions?
Well, I think
I have Councillor Davey next, I think.
Thank you, Chair. It's an odd one, this. If it depends on whether Councillor Herbert's motion is passed or not, because it's not passed, I'm not altogether clear how we as a scrutiny committee can do our job if the information is not transparent. So it's a weird one. I don't know how you'd go, but I mean, presumably we could just leave you to decide how to answer.
The motion comes at the end of the meeting,
Yeah.
so it won't be considered unless the order is altered. It won't come until after this has been taken. Councillor Scutt, your hand is up.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I think that if one peruses the answers to the questions that I asked of the Chair of the Housing Committee, then one will see that the £100 million programme won't be able to be concluded. It's clear from the answers to the questions. Thank you.
I agree, and it would be good to have that on the record from the board. So are we happy with those questions? Thank you very much indeed. So we will work on those and circulate them when they are finalised this afternoon. In view of the time, I'm going to take items 10 and 11 as read, unless I am told that there is something burning that cannot be left to one side. So we're going to take those as read. Thank you very much. Item 12 is the review of scrutiny arrangements, and there is a recommendation here to us that we agree that the Centre for Governance and Scrutiny should carry out a review of the scrutiny arrangements here at the Combined Authority, and that we ask the Combined Authority Board to approve that, because that is something that requires board approval. Does anybody wish to say anything about that proposal?
Only that I wish to support it, Chair.
Good, thank
Me
you very
too.
much indeed.
I'm strongly in support.
Good, that's good to hear. So are we all happy with those recommendations? Happy to agree those? In that case, there will be an urgent report from us to the board for Wednesday to seek their approval for that. So the date of the next meeting is formally the 28th of June 2021 at 11 AM. That will be a new committee, which may include some of us, it may not include others. So in advance of that, but after the elections, i.e. in early June, I've asked for arrangements to be put in place for us to have, or for the committee to have, an informal session to have early sight of the recommendations from that scrutiny review, but also for members of the new committee to get to know who each other are, and to have some formal induction. And there's been work done to reach out to someone who, sorry, I use that awful phrase, reach out, I do apologise. There have been attempts made to contact the person who gave some very useful induction training a little while ago to members. So with that, and as this is the last meeting of this committee in its current form, I'd like to thank all of you who have participated and given us your views, your thoughts, your questions. It's been a very enjoyable year for me, certainly. I hope it's been of enjoyment and interest to you. I'd like to thank all the officers who have helped us with our deliberations and our thoughts and with the administration of these meetings. So thank you enormously to Sue, to Robert, and to Anne, and to Robert Fox in our absence, who has also stood in for us. So thank you enormously. I hope very much to be part of this process again in the forthcoming year. I hope that those of you who aren't standing down will also be. So thank you very much indeed. Councillor Gehring, your hand is up.
Yeah, I think it's just right and proper. I'm a great admirer of yours, Chair, especially because you have remained calm even when the storm was hitting our committee. So warmest congratulations from me, and I hope from other members as well, on your chairpersonship for this committee. It's a great credit to this combined authority that you were such an able and competent chair.
Thank you very much. It's
well
very
done,
kind.
Lorna.
Thank you.
Great job.
Enormously.
Yes.
Thank you. And I very much hope, as I say, to be seeing you all in June. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do we all
Bye.
break into song now? We will meet again.
No.
Well, maybe we'll meet again and find out where the £45 million has gone.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.